Hey everyone, this is Thomas from Lightning Boy Studio. Today's video is going to be a tutorial about the Lightning Boy shader. For those of you who are new to our channel, we offer different types of content here. We have a lot of tutorials that show how you can use Blender in a lot of creative ways, and some of those tutorials are a bit more advanced. But we also sell a non-photorealistic shader called the Lightning Boy shader. So the Lightning Boy shader allows you to do anything from a Toon Shader to a painterly style, and it's very versatile and user-friendly. So as always, we want to thank all of you that have bought this shader. This really support the channel. We love to see all the cool creations you guys are doing with it, but we still receive a lot of questions, and so we can tell that there's still an appetite for people that want to see more tips and tricks on how to use this shader. So this is what this tutorial is going to be about today. And for those of you who don't have the Lightning Boy shader, you can still follow because I'll be showing some beginner-friendly modeling tips as well, so it might come in handy for you as well. Okay, so let's dive in. Alright, so this is a scene that I made for Halloween this year. This is a fan art scene based on the Mario franchise. So it was just a little scene for fun, but when I made this scene, I knew I wanted to tackle two challenges that I would explain in a tutorial like this later. So one of the cool features of the Lightning Boy shader is that you can actually use transparency with the Toon Shader, which is not exactly easy by default if you're making your own Toon Shader. So we're pretty happy with this feature, and we didn't do a tutorial on this yet. So here we have one of the boos. He's actually hiding a little bit and he gets transparent just like he does in the game. So I'm gonna go over how I did that and what are some of the challenges that I encountered by making this. And the other challenge is something that a lot of you have been asking us about online. It's how to light an indoor scene using the Lightning Boy shader. When you first create a scene and apply the Lightning Boy shader, you'll see by default it works really well for an outdoor scene. But if you want to use it for an indoor scene, you have to change a few things about your light and how you're gonna shade your environment. So I just wanted to show you how this works and how I got this look here. So this tutorial will actually be split into two parts. In the first part, I'll focus on the characters, how I modeled the boos, how I made the shader, and how I applied the transparency to it. And in the second part, I'll talk about the environment and how I modeled it and how I used the Lightning Boy shader to light it. So it should make it a bit easier in the future if you want to refer to these videos and try to find specifically a part that interests you. Okay, so here I'm starting with a fresh Blender scene. And since I'm going to be modeling boo first, obviously I'm going to start by creating a sphere. So a little overview of how to set up your scene with the Lightning Boy shader. Usually I open this thing here and I click on the little clock icon, which is a timeline, and I go down and select the shader editor, because this is where you'll find the Lightning Boy shader tab after you installed the add-on, of course. So you click on setup base scene and it'll create a bunch of different elements in your scene. And on the upper right corner, you can click on the shaded rendering mode. And now you'll be able to see that we have a new background color and everything. So you must click on your object and click base material to create a base Lightning Boy shader material for it. If it looks a bit weird, you can right click on it and select shade smooth. And then if you look here, you can see what the base Lightning Boy shader looks like. So you have a color, a key light, and a specular. So here I'm going to start editing my shader. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete the specular and keep only the key light and the color node. So here I'm going to set my color to kind of a dark blue. And this is a tip that I want to remind some of you, it can be useful. But remember, let's say I want the main color of my boo to be some sort of white, and I want the shadow color to be this kind of blue. You should set that shadow color as your base color node and apply the main color to your key light. You don't have to use this setup, but this is what we recommend. We find that it's the easiest way to get really good results with the Lightning Boy shader. Now here I'm clicking on the key light node, and I'm not just clicking on that little drop down arrow to open this node. I'm actually pressing H, because if you just click on the arrow, it will show some of the features but not all of them. So this is a recurring question when using Lightning Boy shader. How come I cannot see the softness, range, and all those other values? So be sure to press H when you click on a node like the key light node, for example. So here I set it to some sort of brighter blue, and I'm adjusting the softness and range to have this kind of cool, soft look that I want for my boo. So before I get started with the modeling, on the upper right here, I click on the edit button and I turn on the auto mirror. This is a add-on that I downloaded. It's available for free online, and what it does is just, you know, a normal mirror function where I can just work on half my mesh and the other half will be a copy of that. So you don't have to do anything twice, and it's pretty standard when modeling. And here I start by selecting a few faces at the back of the sphere, and I can extrude them to begin modeling the tail of this boo. Alright, so here I'm going to speed up the process a little bit, but if you have seen my other tutorial on our channel where I explained some beginner-friendly tips on how to use the Lightning Boy shader, I explained that it's very important to have a good topology when you do any kind of 3D model, really. So topology is basically the mesh, so all these little dots that I'm moving around are called vertices, and you want them to flow along nicely around your character to look like a good smooth line. And here it happened really quickly, but I clicked on the add modifier tab and I added a subdivision modifier so that now the mesh looks more soft when this is turned on, but I can turn it on and off. And once again, I'm pushing and pulling every single point to make sure that they all flow nicely together. And yeah, it's a bit of a long process, but at the same time, it's kind of relaxing. You can just put on some nice music, and I tend to like just turn my brain off and do this for a while. And there's something satisfying with just making these lines flow nicely on your mesh, especially knowing that it will be very useful later, because when you move your light around, it'll always look nice. So here I'm going back in the shader editor, and I'm gonna press Shift A to open this menu that allows me to create something new. At the very bottom it says Lightning Boy Shader Nodes, or LBS nodes. This only appears because I installed the Lightning Boy Shader, of course. And if you click on it, you can see a bunch of nodes that are custom from the Lightning Boy Shader. And now I'm going to choose the Ambient Occlusion SS. So I plug it in, and as you can tell, nothing changes. It's not showing up. It's because you need to go to the option on the right over here, this little camera icon, and then you need to turn on ambient occlusion. So you need to click on that little check mark, and then it's gonna work. As you can tell here, I can start adjusting my settings a little bit, and the ambient occlusion is really cool for exactly a case like this. So if I go back to what the shader looked like before I applied the occlusion, my shader is very, very simple right now. It's either lit or unlit, and then the zone of transition between lit and unlit is very small. I set it like that on purpose so that it looks a little bit like cartoony, but that means that there's less opportunities to get nice details to feel the 3D-ness of this shape. So if you look right now, the tail is like just a flat color. There's no information. We can't tell where there is a fold and where the sphere stops and when the tail begins. But when I apply the occlusion, it fakes as if the mesh casts a shadow upon itself if it's close to a fold, basically. So it's not exactly a shadow, but it's trying to emulate it. And in this case, it's great to give me that missing information of that fold when the tail is in the shadow. So now I'm gonna give it a color. I want it to be some sort of nice darker blue than my normal shadow. And then you can adjust like range and softness to make it look good. But as you can tell right now, it's still looking a bit weird. That's because the modeling is weird. So I need to improve the modeling of the tail to make sure that this will look right. And by default, the ambient occlusion can look a bit grainy, but there's different ways to kind of make it more smooth. You can increase samples when rendering and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of info online on how to improve the look of ambient occlusion. At this stage, I have a decent base for the body of the boo, and I'm gonna reuse that for the other two models. So I keep a copy, and then I start creating the mouth for this one. So I just select faces and I delete them, and then I start modeling the inside of the mouth and all that stuff. But this is not always recommended. It depends on what kind of model you're working on. In this case, it's just this scene and it's nothing else, and nothing is animated, so I can kind of model the mouth in the shape I want. But if you want your character to be animated, it might be a bit trickier. Probably you can't do that. But see, in a case like this mouth is so cartoony that if I modeled it like kind of straight, and then with a rig you want to open it into a big smile, like you're gonna stretch the mesh so much that it might end up looking a bit weird. So yeah, with more cartoony faces, it might be better to just model it like this. And in my case, it was not an issue because, like I said, it's not animated. Another thing that I like a lot with working with the Lightning Boy shader is I can easily create a new piece of geometry, in this case the inside of the mouth, and create a new Lightning Boy shader material and give it a base color and then a key light, and boom, it already looks pretty cool. In my case, I just find it's easier to model when I can kind of see some of the colors instead of working in grayscale all the time. Sometimes it gets a bit tricky to really know how these colors will fit together, and working with colors like this can help me actually improve the shape of the modeling a little bit. So a little trick right now too is, as you can tell right now, I have two meshes and they each have their own material. So one has the red material and the other one has the white material. But here you can tell that where the geo touch between these two, it's a bit janky, like it's kind of uneven, and it would be kind of hard to make them match. So one thing I do is I select a row of faces on the mesh that has the white material, and I assign the mouth material there. So now it actually follows the topology pretty well, and where the two meshes touch each other, it actually looks pretty seamless because it's the same material and it's a very simple material. So now I'm gonna speed up the video a little bit, but basically, as you can tell, I'm just creating a new mesh for the teeth, and I'm creating a new material, which is gonna be white, but brighter than the rest of the body. And once again, it's pretty cool because like in a few clicks, I already have a Toon Shader that works really well for the teeth, and I can just start placing them. So yeah, I think it's pretty powerful to be able to just have your material look good while you model. It's pretty fun. So so here I'm just messing around until I find the right shape for the teeth, and didn't want to have too many gaps in between them. So, you know, it's trial and error. And then I start modeling the tongue. For the tongue, I'm using kind of the same material as the other ones, except this time I keep the specular. Specular tend to make things look a bit wet, so it's pretty perfect for a tongue like this. And once again, few clicks, and already I had something that looks decent. Next, I start working on the eyes and the eyebrows. And in terms of shader, it couldn't be simpler because now I'm just applying, well, the Lightning Boy shader again, but like in terms of material, it's just a color node, in this case black, and nothing else, because I don't want key light, I don't want it to be affected by light, I don't want occlusion or anything. So it's gonna be black, and that way it kind of looks like a pen stroke or something. Obviously, this could have been done via textures, but you might have noticed already, like I'm not unfolding any UVs for this model. I'm trying to keep it as easy for me to work on as possible. And there's something nice about having the eyes and the eyebrows, like kind of little bumps over the mesh. Like there's something cool about it. The other plus side too is a mesh has kind of infinite resolution, so you can zoom in with your camera as much as you want and you won't see like pixels, versus if you are using a texture, you might need to use a 4K texture, 8K if like you're zooming in really close, but you won't have that problem if you model eyes and eyebrows like this. So next I started modeling the arms, and like I said before, in this case, since this character is not going to be rigged or animated, I know it's just going to be like in one shot and they're going to be frozen in place. I could kind of cheat and basically model the arms and place them exactly where I wanted on the body, which once again I wouldn't really recommend if you want your character to be animated. In that case, your arms should probably be roughly at the middle of the body, so you can move them upwards and downwards and limit how much deformation there's going to be. But it would still be a bit of a challenge, I think, to get them this high. So in my case, I was like, oh, I'll just place them straight up there and it's going to be a bit easier. And then I could start working on the face of the second Boo, which is the one that is scared. So what's nice is I already had the eyes and eyebrows from the happy Boo. So I could basically just modify the shape of the eyes and the eyebrows and try to make it look scared instead. And for the mouth, I drew a curve. And then you can kind of extrude from that curve a mesh. And I was experimenting with different mouth placement, mouth shapes. And I brought the arms really quickly because his pose, like his hands are hiding his face. And so I felt like having it early on would help me with the modeling. Another thing I did with the mouth over here is you'll notice usually artists, when they draw something like a mouth or eyes, they tend to have like different thickness in their lines. So this mouth, if it was like even the whole way through, it looks very CG and a bit soulless. But if some parts of the mouth are a bit thicker and some parts are a bit thinner, then it looks more like it was thought through and crafted in a way that looks more like a mouth. All right, so next we're going to go back in the Lightning Boy shader and we're gonna start working on adding this little pink area in the front of the face to make him look a bit shy and scared. So one thing you might notice here is I kind of ran out of space in my Lightning Boy shader kind of main node. So this is the one in which I plug in all those smaller nodes. And if this is your first time watching a Lightning Boy shader tutorial, it's very easy to add more slots in this node. You can just click on that little arrow here or even type in the number of entries you want. You can go up to 12 slots in this. And next I'm going to press Shift A to bring up that add a new node window. I'm going to go back to the Lightning Boy shader tab and I'm going to bring one of my favorite nodes, which is called the Spherical Gradient. So when you click on the setup base scene and it adds a bunch of stuff in your scene like I showed you before, one of the things that gets created is a spherical gradient. It's just a null that's like a sphere like this. And if you bring it into your mesh, you can kind of see that it will have a color gradient from the outside to the center of the sphere on your mesh. So one of the first thing I'm going to do is give it the proper reddish color. But as you can tell, the first issue that I get is this gradient affects the hands too, but I want the hands to remain white and the face to be red. So my first idea was to basically create two materials. So what I'm going to do is there's going to be one material for the whole body that doesn't have that spherical gradient node. So even if the spherical gradient is touching the skin of Boo, it cannot turn it red. But then I will also have a second material just for the face, and that material does have the spherical gradient node, so it can react, it can become red, and that way the hands will remain white, but the face will be red. So here you can see as soon as I assign that material to the body, then it just works. And I have the red face without the red hands. So here I can adjust the color a bit to get it to what I want. The next thing I want to add are little lines on the face to kind of have this graphic look, these little lines to make someone look shy or embarrassed. So for that, I'm going to create another node called the hatch style, which does exactly that. It's going to be like lines, angled lines, and you can change the rotation and a bunch of other values. So one of the first thing I tried doing is using the mask from the spherical gradient node and plugging that into the opacity of the hatch style node. And as you can tell, it kind of works. What it does now is those hatch style are going to be within the same area of gradient as the red color. But you'll see later, I actually didn't quite like that look, so I will change it, but that's one way where the mask of one node can affect the opacity of another one. You can be really creative and hook one node into another one like that. So here I'm playing with the opacity and spacing of my lines. But here I play with two other interesting values. So I changed the erosion and distortion of those lines. And I change it just barely. Honestly, if you don't know that I altered those, you might not even know I did this. But I just want them to be slightly not perfect, because by default, those lines are all perfectly mathematically straight. But by adding a little bit of erosion and a little bit of distortion, they just might be slightly squiggly, look a bit more like someone drew them with a pen instead of done with a mathematical equation. So among all the options that you have with the hatch style, you kind of can't control the color of the hatch style, but that's very easy to fix. You can just bring a color node, the same that I used before on the shader. So here I'm going to duplicate this one. So I can set my color and plug the layer into this little like bar icon. And now I can control the color of my hatch style. So one thing I don't like is if I move the camera around, this is currently screen spaced. So these lines will stay, they kind of float on the character, and I just don't really like that look. So I'm gonna have to unfold the UVs of the front of the face, and I do it really quickly, right? I just select those faces, go to the UV editor, and click unwrap. And I don't even need to care about the orientation of this or anything. I just need it to be unwrapped. And now I can go in the settings of the hatch style and set the screen space setting to 0. And now if I rotate around, these lines will always stay on the face of the character. They won't like float if I move my camera. By changing this, it does mess with the original size and spacing of this, so I need to retweak it one more time. But now, like I said before, I don't like that I have kind of a soft gradient for the red color on the face, and those hash lines that I did go just as far along the face. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go all the way to my spherical gradient in the outliner, and I'm gonna duplicate it, and I'm gonna have a second spherical gradient control just the hatch style. So I duplicate it, now it's just called the same name, but it has 2 at the end. And this one I'm gonna make it like more slim, and then I can go in the options here of my spherical gradient, and if you press tab on some of these nodes, you can actually access some deeper settings. In the case of the spherical gradient, you can access the option to assign which spherical gradient is going to affect this node. So here I'm going to give it a name. I'm just going to call it 2, and I'm going to assign it to the correct spherical gradient, and there you go. Now I can move this one, and as you can tell, I have one spherical gradient that controls the lines and one that controls the redness of the eyes, and that way I have more control over how this looks. So the next part was working on the third and final boo. It's the one that has a Shy Guy mask. And in terms of modeling, this Shy Guy mask proved to be the hardest part of the whole scene, pretty much. Basically, you might have encountered a situation like this before, but if you have like a very soft and round surface and you need to dig holes into it, it's often a bit problematic. You could use a Boolean to dig the holes, but in this case I tried modeling them myself, hoping that it would look a bit better. And I go through the whole process here of making the mask, and I only realize that it's wrong until way later when I'm in the scene. So that's why I'm not explaining how I'm doing this mask right now. But sometimes you might encounter a situation where you start lighting your character and all of a sudden it catches very ugly shadows and a lot of little jagged edges everywhere. And you might think this is the Lightning Boy shader's fault, but it's actually the fault of the modeling itself. When it's very round and soft and you need to dig holes, it can very often look wrong. So I'm gonna go over how I fixed it later. And here I'm just creating the little headband around the head. So one little detail is, so far in the scene, every character only has 2 tones. They have kind of the dark part and a bright part. But when I was looking at the little headband, somehow I felt it was a bit empty. So it's the only part that has like 3 tones. So I just duplicated the key light, gave it a bit of a brighter color, and changed the range a bit. And then I thought it looked cool. So here I had all 3 characters and I was ready to work on the environment. Here I'm jumping ahead to that one problem I mentioned earlier, which is when I started lighting the scene with my boos in it, I started noticing something horribly wrong with the Shy Guy mask. So as you can tell, it's catching ugly shadows, especially near those holes that I cut in the mesh. So it took me a while to figure out what was going on. A good way to try to debug a situation like this for me was like, first of all, hiding the environment, making sure that it was not the environment messing up with my scene. And then I tried to look into like the settings of my lights, but it had nothing to do with that. When I zoomed in, I could see, okay, the mesh is completely wrong. There's a bunch of triangles and a bunch of faces with more than 4 sides. And all of that makes this shading look very ugly. So I had to go back into my previous scene where I just had the characters and start a whole new mask from scratch. Now I'm gonna skip some of my failed attempts here and just go to the attempt that ended up working, but it took me a few tries to figure out a good way to make this work. So one thing I did is this mask here is very high res. It has a high density of faces, which once again, I wouldn't recommend in general, especially if you need this to be rigged. If you want to like move this with bones, it's gonna look a bit weird, but luckily in my case, this is just a mask. So it worked in my case. And then I cut a hole for the mouth and you can tell it still looked really ugly. There's a bunch of little triangles everywhere. So the shadows still look really wrong. The solution I found was to make a ring of faces around the hole. So this way, I guess the light can just know a bit better where the light hits. And so now it just gets rid of all those little weird triangle and jagged edges. My guess is you could probably get away with a less dense mesh for the round surface. But in my case, I was just happy that this worked and I moved on. I didn't want to remake it for like a 4th time. So now I brought back this new mesh in the scene and yeah, the problem was fixed. So sometimes if you hit an issue like this, it can be a bit demoralizing. And when I hit this one, it kind of took me like 2 nights to debug it and get a decent mesh. Like everything was going well and then all of a sudden it doesn't and you're like, why am I even making this scene? But don't give up, keep on debugging and eventually you should be able to figure out what's the issue. Okay, so I'm gonna make one of the boos, the one that's being shy, transparent. And this is something I could have done earlier, but I wanted to wait until I had the actual environment made because I wanted to see how the transparency would react with the environment, would make it a bit easier for me to adjust. So if you're used to how Blender works in general, when you need to make something transparent, you need to go into that little icon to the right, which is the material tab. And in there you can see the materials that are assigned. But if you go down, there's a bunch of settings, including blend mode and shadow mode. So the blend mode, you want to go for either alpha ash or alpha blend. And the shadow modes, yeah, there's a bunch, but here I'm just going to set to none. I don't want him to cast shadows at all. And once you do that, if you look at the Lightning Boy shader, the main node, there's now a shader opacity that appeared and alpha mask as well. So you can plug something if you want to be more specific with your transparency. But in this case, I'm just gonna set a number for it. And as you can tell, only the face is affected right now. So I'm gonna do the same thing to the rest of the body. But right now, the main boo body material is also assigned to the other 2 boos. So I don't want to affect it straight up. What I want to do is click on this material and then click on this little icon on the right here. This is going to make a copy, like a new version of this material that's only on my character. And I'm going to call it LBS Boo Transparent. And so I can do the same thing on this one as I did on the previous one. So I can now set the blend mode to alpha blend and set the shadow mode to none. And now if I give it the same values as the previous one, they should match. And now you can kind of seamlessly blend them together. But you can start seeing one of the first issues with working with the transparency here. So basically, Blender doesn't like that there are 2 transparent materials on the same mesh. And it's making it so that the tail and the back of the character is kind of visible through. And I tried a few things for that, but I'll show you how to fix it later. I'm just going to move on to make the rest of the face transparent so you can see some other issues that you can encounter with this. So next, I'm going to do the same thing with the black material that is used for the eyes, the eyebrows, and the mouth. So I need to click on that little icon to make a duplicate, and I'm going to call it LBS Black Transparent. And I'm going to assign that material to all the eyes, eyebrows, and the mouth on this specific boo. And then I set the blend mode to alpha blend and the shadows to none like the rest of the body. And now I'm noticing something else that is a bit weird. The right eye and the right eyebrow of the character, they react a bit differently. And not only that, if I move around, it doesn't know how to sort if the material is on top of the rest of the body or behind the rest of the body. So Blender has a hard time basically rendering this correctly. So one of the things that I did to kind of help Blender a little bit is select all the pieces of the face and then the rest of the body, and right click and select join. This should make it a bit easier for Blender to handle. But sadly, even with all that, as you can tell here, let's say I take the material for the eyes and mouth and I make it more visible, you can tell that they're still rendering differently from the rest. So there's something wrong with them and we need to figure out what it is. So one good thing to do if you're ever stuck in a case like this is, well, first of all, I'm going to undo the merge. So now all the eyes are separate. So you can select all the eyes like this and then go in edit mode. And then while you select your faces, you can go on this little arrow in the upper right corner and click on this little icon to show the normals. So this shows you the direction that your faces are pointing towards. So right now this looks fine. Everything is pointing outwardly, so that's good. But if I click on this left eyebrow over here, you can see in the item tab in the upper right, you can look at the XYZ scale of this object. And, you know, they're all a bit messy, but at least there's no negative. So it's kind of fine for now. But on the right one, the X scale is actually set to -1. So that's bad. Basically, once again, it's messing up with our rendering here. So to fix this, you need to press Control A to open the Apply Transform menu. You can choose which transformation you want to basically apply and revert to the basic value. I know it can be a bit complex for some of you that don't really know how this works, but basically I'm just going to apply the scaling. And as you can tell now, it's back to 1, 1, 1. So there's no negative anymore. So we could think that this is fixed, but if we look at the normals now, so as you can tell, when we fixed the scaling, it ended up messing up with the normal orientation. So select the faces that you want to flip the normals of, and then click on the mesh tab at the top, go to normals and flip. And now you have fixed both the scaling issue and the normal issue. And now if you join everything, it'll finally work. And now you can adjust the opacity of the head, and yeah, now it knows how to sort everything together. Okay, so now let's move on to the final fix that we needed to address, which is being able to see the tail through the body because of the two materials. So basically, if you remember how Blender liked that we kind of joined the face and the rest of the body together, we're going to do the same principle but with materials instead. So we're going to have the same material applied to the entire body. So this idea I had of using two materials, one just for the face and one for the rest of the body, actually worked pretty well, and it would have been fine unless I want to work with transparency in this case. So it's a bit of a tip, once again, or a heads up I can give to you is you can be pretty creative with the shader, but the more you start to be ambitious with how you want your shader to work, so let's say you want it to be transparent on top of everything else, it's more likely that some of the things you're doing will break. It depends how far you want to push your character or your scene. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the entire body and assign the same material, the one that can be read, to both. And instantly you can tell it fixes the transparency issue, but now the problem is the hands become red because they're affected by the spherical gradient. So I'm going to do kind of a very simple fix that maybe I should have done first. And it's simply to push the gradient deeper inside the character so it doesn't peek through the hands. But when I do that, I do need to go inside the settings of the spherical gradient, press tab to see more options, and adjust the softness of it so that we can actually see it, because otherwise you kind of can't see this node anymore because it's pushed so deep inside the head. And there you have it with this simple fix. Now everything is fixed. And now for the final part of this character tutorial If you look at the end result that I showed earlier, the one thing that I didn't show you how to do was adding the backlight on the characters. So you see this little strong light that's actually at the back of the characters. This is something that I ended up doing pretty late because when I was working with the characters in an empty environment, it didn't look like they needed a backlight. But once the characters were put in that scene, it felt like, well, there's a big window behind them. So it seems like we should see a strong light hitting their back so that it feels like they're being lit correctly. So let's see how I did this. First thing is, once again, you open the Lightning Boy Shader tab in the shader editor, and I'm going to bring a new key light node. If you look at the key light node and you open it with the H button, you can see a little drop-down menu that says character, but if you click on it, there's other choices. We explained how the lights work in the Lightning Boy Shader in other videos, so I'm going to keep it very brief this time. But basically, when you create your setup base scene, there are 3 lights that are created: the character key light, background key light, and extra key light. And in this tab, you choose which of those 3 lights is going to affect this node. So in this case, I'm going to set it to extra, and now it's going to react to my extra key light. By default, those 3 lights are set to sunlights. And normally that's fine, but because I'm in an indoor scene, I need to change that into a spotlight. I'm going to go over in more details in the part 2 of this tutorial on how this works. But for now, let's just say we're setting it up to a spotlight. I'm bringing it over here and placing it so that it lights my character, but it's still not affecting it. Now I need to click on the power value and set that way higher. Normally we say you should never mess with the settings of your light. So don't change the color and don't change the power unless you're working in an indoor scene and now you're changing your light to a spotlight. All of a sudden you do need to increase the power of that spotlight. So now it's working well, as you can see, and I'm going to duplicate this light, and I'm basically going to light each of my characters with their own individual spotlight. And what's really useful in this case is I don't want the spotlight to affect my environment at all, but because my environment is not set to react to the extra key light, I can just place these lights however I want, and it won't mess up with the lights and shadows of the rest of the scene at all. So here I'm clicking on the key light tab and I'm changing the color of this light. And now I'm going to go on the rendering tab over here, and under Ambient Occlusion, there's a bloom section. And if you turn that on and adjust the settings a little bit, you can start to have a nice bloom, which makes the light look like it's glowing a little bit. You can also adjust some settings in your key light itself. You can change the value there. And if you crank that up, that's another way to adjust the level of bloom that you're getting. And then I did the same thing for the third boo. But this one is transparent. So basically I had to crank up the values very high to be able to even see this backlight. Now, as you can tell, if you're looking at the boo with the Shy Guy mask, his little headband is actually not reacting to this backlight at all. When you're working with normal materials in Blender, if you put one light somewhere, it's going to affect everything around it. So if you're used to that, it might take some time getting used to working with the Lightning Boy shader. But basically, you absolutely need to bring that specific key light node so that the material knows, oh, I need to react to that extra spotlight. So you can easily copy and paste a node from one material to another. And once I plug it in, there you go. Already it's working just fine. But it can be a bit tricky if, let's say, you're working on a scene and all of a sudden you decide you want to add a backlight and you had multiple materials over multiple characters. You're gonna have to apply this manually everywhere. So that was it for how I made the characters for the scene. I hope you learned interesting things, and you can click on the link to see part 2, in which I will explain how I made the environment that you can see here. All right, have a great day and see you next time.